Welcome to our introduction of Heraclitus and Parmenides. These are representatives of a group of thinkers that has come to be called the pre-socratics, the philosophers who lived before and during the lifetime of Socrates, which ranged from about 469 BC to 399 when he was executed. The pre-socratics represent the beginning of philosophy in history as a defined tradition of discourse. And we want to ask ourselves right off the bat, is philosophy something that began at a certain point in history? Or is it something that begins in each of us when we have a real question, that we have a desire, a drive to get the answer for? Or is it both? Which is my answer. That it is both the case that philosophy is something that, as Aristotle points out towards the beginning of the Metaphysics, he says, "For it is owing to their wonder that humans both now begin and at first began to philosophize. They wondered originally at the obvious difficulties, then advanced little by little and stated difficulties about the greater matters, for example, about the phenomena of the moon, and those of the sun and of the stars, and about the genesis of the whole. And a man who is puzzled and wonders thinks himself ignorant. Whence even a lover of myth is in a sense a lover of wisdom, for the myth is composed of wonders. Therefore, since they philosophized in order to escape from ignorance, evidently they were pursuing science in order to know, and not for any utilitarian end." Aristotle understands, and he's the source of a lot of our account of the pre-Socratics. He understands that there is both a historical tradition of philosophy and he understands the existential basis of philosophy. And he put it in that Socratic way, right? If I'm astonished by some fact, the basic one is, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is this thing in front of me the way it is? To see what's always around us and to see it fresh, to see it as something startling and strange. That is the philosophical position, according to Aristotle, and I agree with that. To wonder why the stars are always there, but to look up and to say, oh, they're beautiful, and do they mean something, and why do they move the way they do? That's the beginning of philosophy because it sets up a desire to know about the whole, and that's what philosophy means, right? Philosophia, to have this love, this friendly desire for wisdom, Sophia. So that desire to know has this consequence of, I don't know. To know that you don't know, that's the Socratic position. So it's that puzzlement, befuddlement, to realize I don't have all the answers, to realize that I need to do some work if I'm going to actually get some satisfaction for this thirst, this desire to know about this wonderful thing in front of me, this wonderful whole and these wonderful parts and the wonderful relationships between them. Okay, well that's the philosophical position. And as Aristotle knows, that's what drives the creation of myth too. The spiritual quest for the meaning of existence, that was there, we saw with Gilgamesh, right? This is when you have the leisure to start to ask questions, when you're not just fighting off predators and just scraping a little food together to not starve, when you're able to rise a little bit above subsistence, when civilization starts to take hold, then we're able to catch our breath and to look around and to wonder. And then the myths start to come up, and then we tell stories. That's what mythos means, is a story, a plot, a narrative, and we tell stories to make sense of the whole. The question I want to frame our introduction with is, does philosophizing have anything to do with living well? Obviously that twofold meaning of philosophy is it leads to ambiguities when we think about, well, is philosophy something that I want to be doing? Well, on the account of philosophy is what happens when you wonder, well, that's just what humans do when we're paying attention. Well, obviously you can't answer that question then, well, if I'm going to live mindfully, thoughtfully, deliberately, well, of course I'm going to be asking questions about why it's so wonderful. But there's that other meaning, right? Philosophy is a tradition, the philosophy that's taught in universities, the philosophy that's in the books, the great books of the tradition. Does that have anything to do with a good life? We obviously think so in the Great Conversation. Lots of philosophers, not just philosophers, we have lots of poets and so on, but philosophers are an important part of the Great Conversation. So we would like to argue that, in fact, having this tradition, this history of conversation before us helps us to wonder well and to be puzzled in a way that is good for our development as humans and as fellow humans. Somehow to become mindful of what others have answered with regard to the great questions makes us better dialogue partners. It keeps that dialectic, the dialogue going. That is an essential part, maybe the most essential part of a life well lived is to be in dialogue. Okay, well that's part of what I think is at stake with the emergence of philosophy, which happens historically, according to standard accounts, with Thales of Miletus around 585 BC. Miletus was one of the great commercial cities of the Greek world at the time. That's important because one of the things about civilization is that you've got density of population, you've got minds coming up against other minds, you've got ways of life that are different from other ways of life that are confronting each other. That dynamic is productive of spiritual breakthroughs. Well, trade is part of that. The confrontation of civilizations in trade is part of that. The building of networks and the energizing effect of networks leads to new thoughts. So Miletus, part of Ionia, which is a section of the western Anatolian or Turkish coast as we know it now, which is where Homer was reputedly from. So that's important too, that a little bit before, about a century before Thales, you already had another person from this rich area who's trying to grapple with these existential questions in a different mode. Thales, we don't really have any direct words from. One problem with the biggest problem with studying the pre-socratic is that we only have either fragments quoted in much later authors sometimes, or testimonia, that is descriptions of the positions, and that's what we have for Thales. Supposedly, Thales was searching for the arche, which is a very important word. We see it in archaeology, for instance, but arche is the origin, the source, the principle, the controlling element, the thing that explains ultimately what is, and so on. So arche means so much. According to the Testimonia, Thales believed that the arche was water. So that his account of where things come from and where they tend towards, it was water. Now that sounds awfully primitivist to us, but we might try to just understand that the big breakthrough here is that instead of a mythos, a myth that goes first, starts with the heroes and gods, right? That talks about the order of this world in terms of heroic deeds and the decisions of divine councils, for instance. What you have is a different kind of inquiry, not opposed. you have mythos on the one hand, and then logos is the word that one would associate with philosophy. The philosopher is trying to give a different kind of account. Same meaning, but beneath both myth and logos is the same quest for the meaning of existence, but a different way of carrying out that quest. We don't want to oppose the two. That really doesn't make any sense. When we look at Parmenides and read what we've got from his work, you see he's writing it as a poem, and poetry is part of that political mythology that we have all along, and he's presenting it in a mythological setting. But he's giving us, for instance, in Parmenides, what you have there is the first sustained argument that we have record of. So it's not that myth and logos are opposed. It's that the logos of the philosopher is trying to think through things in a more rigorous way, in a way searching for the arche, not in terms of stories of divine melodrama, but is trying to think through how one thing leads to another, causality, without resorting to the gods first, not excluding the gods. That's different from modern rationalism, which is a different kind of ratio, is the Latin equivalent of logos. So modern rationalism is very much opposed to mythology, is very much opposed to religion. That's not the way it was in the pre-modern age. So we want to try to, certainly not in the classical age, we want to try to keep that tension because I think it's very important. But we both see the commonality, but also see the distinction between the discourses. Something new happens. When Thales says that water is the arche, something is happening. It's a thing that leads ultimately to modern scientific procedure that is even a believer in a religion can still follow scientific methodology, which brackets the existence of God and in giving an account of how the water cycle works, how the rock cycle works, and so on, right? So one need not have the two opposed. However, one does want to note that at the beginning, that logos can have that tendency to then fight against mythology. And it becomes very complicated already with Plato, and we might have time to see that when we get to Plato. How is mythological poetry going to stand to the new logos that the philosopher is trying to pursue? Again, with Parmenides, he's a mystic. He's a mystic of being as such. And of course, with Heraclitus, we have the great celebration of flux, of becoming. And putting the two together, and they both seem to have flourished around 500 BC, is extremely fruitful for our own consideration of the structure of the world. Is it the case that, as Heraclitus says, you can't step into the same river twice? Does that have larger implications? Does that mean there is no firm footing in existence, nothing to hang your existential hat on? Parmenides doesn't like, if Parmenides is after Heraclitus, if he had read Heraclitus, we don't know, but the network that the process of Greek colonization set up makes it possible that Parmenides could be in conversation with Heraclitus. But in any case, Parmenides says the thing isn't this thing that is not being and not quite being, which is becoming, right? When a thing changes, it both is and is not. An acorn is and is not an oak tree, right? So that's the process of becoming. Parmenides wants to say, look, I'm a mystic of being. What I'm struck by is the fact that the whole is. He's standing before existence and is just struck by is. And does one have to say either one is right or wrong? The point of engaging in this philosophical conversation, this dialectic, is to just take both to heart and to verify by one's own attentive experience of reality. I wanted to go back a little bit to the placement of Heraclitus, who he was born in Ephesus after the Persian takeover of the the western coast of modern-day Turkey. Around 500, if the traditional dating is right. That's a little south of the Ionian area that Homer would have come from, but all part of that same Greek colonizing kind of mindset. That is, when the Dark Ages were passing away and the Archaic Age was coming into being in the Greek-speaking world, part of that was not just the restoration of alphabetic literacy, or the assumption of alphabetic literacy, but there was more population. And Greece being so mountain-bound, anytime there was an increase of population, the Greeks had to go out. So there'd already been one wave of colonization in the Dark Ages. Now there was another one happening when Homer was writing, if he was writing. This spreading out throughout the Mediterranean, and in fact up around the Black Sea littoral, that is the shoreline. The Greeks loved, they didn't just love the sea, they needed to be near the sea. Almost every polis, the plural for polis, almost every Greek polis was within 25 miles of the shoreline. They were seafaring, the sea was in their blood, as it were. So they spread throughout the Mediterranean, the Black Sea littoral, and they lived out a literally cosmopolitan network. And so they were drawing in all of the wisdom of the ancient Mesopotamians, all the way into what would be Western Europe. They were on the edge of an empire when this process was beginning. The ancient Near East was always trading imperial heads. In the 700s, it was the Assyrians, and we know this from biblical history. Then it was the new Neo-Babylonians, and then it was eventually the Persians, right? And that's the one that would eventually confront the Macedonians under Alexander the Great, and again the Romans. So this cosmopolitanism, the fact that the Greeks they always spread out, they were very successful warriors. That military might was so important in explaining why the Greeks had such influence. They spread out. They spread out more than anybody else, and so they Hellenized the Mediterranean. In this ferment, which cosmopolitanism sets up, this networking of different regions and ways of being, what we have then, the matrix for Thales and of all the other pre-Socratics. So in Miletus, where Thales was from, we have great names such as Anaximander, who posited an arche, it seems, of the indefinite. He didn't like a material arche like water. He wanted to say that source of everything has to be something unbounded, limitless. And then following him, it seems, you have Anaximenes, who wants to kind of combine Thales and Anaximander and talks about the arche being air, something that is material, elemental, but more diffuse, more like the Anaximandrian limitless, and so on. We have these great. We have Pythagoras. We have the Atomists of Democritus. We have Empedocles, this fascinating thinker who supposedly cast himself into the mouth of Mount Etna, and so on. So where Heraclitus comes from is that western Turkish area. Where Parmenides comes from is Aelia, which is one of the cities of what the Romans would call Magna Graecia, which is the Greek settlements in southern Italy and Sicily. So again, this conversation was happening all around the Mediterranean. It was drawing on very ancient communities. It was on the edge of empire. It was the birth of philosophy. That birth still matters to us. If we read the aphorisms of Heraclitus and let ourselves be moved by them, and everybody loves reading Heraclitus. The thinker that he's most analogous to is Nietzsche, and same effect too. In the great conversation, these two always get this great response. Well, why? They trigger a passion of thinking. It's thinking. And that, if you read those aphorisms from Heraclitus, he talks about maybe fire as the arche, but he talks about war as the arche, or maybe the playing child as the arche. He's making us think through the whole tradition he's inherited at this point, but it's always something new and fresh. And then we turn to the very different thinker that Parmenides is, very, very mystical, but also this astonishing first sustained, as we call it, ontological argument about being. If we can enter into that conversation and let it mesh with our own existential desire to know, and let it inflame that desire, and let it energize the desire, and let it empower that desire to have more words and more ways of being realized, then we might find that philosophy isn't just a thing that we can take up or put down at will. It's at the very basis of what it means to live a life well.